The discovery of hundreds of Indigenous children in mass graves across Canada, the shooting of Breonna Taylor, the death of George Floyd. All of these major news events have left us sad and grieving. Can you mourn someone you do not know personally, or be connected to a specific community and experience grief around violence and harm in the aftermath of these powerful events? That's what we're talking about now. Equity, diversity consultant and educator Kayla Carter joins me to talk about all of this. And Kayla, you talk about collective grief. Can you just explain that concept for me?
Absolutely. Collective grief is something that a lot of us may not know what it is, but we're definitely experiencing it. So collective grief is a kind of grief that communities, societies, nations, diasporas can absolutely experience whenever they've gone through an abrupt change or loss. So sometimes this can look like war. Sometimes this can even look like a huge thing that's taken place within the world and global warming and weather. But for a lot of us now, it's looked like a global pandemic. So a lot of us are experiencing a lot of collective grief that we don't always realize.
Absolutely. Now, how do we make space for public grief? And how can public mourning actually strengthen or even create community?
Absolutely. So I think the thing with public mourning that a lot of us may not even realize is that public mourning actually confirms what we feel about what's going on in the world around us. In a way, public mourning is our first introduction to having a community around the things that we are grieving, around the things that we've been losing. So in a lot of ways, public mourning confirms that we're not the only ones, but actually that we don't have to go through this alone. We can actually do this together, but we can also be inspired to change in a lot of ways if we allow that grief to actually teach us.
Is there a correct way to grieve? And do we need to explain why we're not responding as our friends, family, and colleagues feel we should? Because people will question, I mean, you didn't know George Floyd, and you don't know these children, these babies who are underground. Why is it affecting you so hardcore? So let's talk about that a bit.
Yeah, definitely. And when it comes to this sort of idea, a lot of us understand grief as like you're weeping and you're crying, and we expect it to look a very specific way. However, for a lot of us, grief can look like just about anything. My rule of thumb with a lot of the work that I do is as long as you're not causing harm to yourself or others, your grief can look like whatever it needs to look like. Whenever people expect us to perform grief in a very specific way, it's usually because they're uncomfortable with their own grief as well. Being able to have your grief witnessed by people that you trust is more important than actually explaining it so that everyone gets it. Because then you start to creep into trying to make your grief legitimate to other people. Whereas at that point, you really need to focus on giving yourself the space to grieve, but also finding community in the space to grieve as well.
We've lost a lot of that during this pandemic. And that was one of the things that was the saddest to witness, that people passed, hundreds, thousands of people passed away, and we were not able to join and grieve. What does that do to the grief process, do you think?
I think in a lot of ways it completely interrupts it. For a lot of us, we have not only gone through a pandemic, but we're also dealing with the fact that the world right now does not look the way that it looked before we went into this pandemic. A lot of us are really trying to grapple with, how do I go back into this world that is a lot different from what I thought it was, but also what do I do now with the fact that so many of the people who were so close to me, so much of the world has changed, and I don't know how to hold that, and that's a really real space to be in.
Absolutely. So speaking of that, you know, this idea of grieving the way people need you to grieve to make them feel more comfortable, capitalism really plays a role in how we view grief and death, in that your allocation of days off is based on the perceived closeness of that family member to you. So basically your company is saying, well, you might have been very close to that aunt, but you get no bereavement days, but you get bereavement days for a spouse. How can they be in that space and deciding who you should care about and who you should just sort of move on from?
Absolutely. And I mean, that's a really amazing question, because it really forces us to sit with the fact that a lot of these policies were not made with us in mind. It was made with an idea of who we were expected to be in order to participate in capitalism. However, I've said this before, and I love saying it all the time. Capitalism cannot begin to fathom the power of human connection, right? Mm-hmm. So I say this for myself, that most of the aunties that I have in my life, I am not biologically related to them in any way, shape, or form. However, it in no ways demonstrates the lack of connection that I have with them, or how pivotal a role they played in the village that was used and that I needed to raise me. And for most policies, they usually give you about 5 days. And for most of us who know what it feels like to grieve, 5 days is not enough. 5 days is just the beginning of a lot of our grief. Furthermore, when we're also thinking about the LGBTQ2AI plus community, for a lot of us, we are constantly reinventing, rethinking, and reimagining what family is. For so many of us, we're constantly having to build and create our own families, and that is sacred. And once again, a lot of these policies cannot fathom a family that not only doesn't subscribe to the very nuclear family, but a family that is constantly changing.
Absolutely. Okay, so grief is sneaky, and it's individual, and it's personal. What can we do to help ease some of this pain so many of us are feeling right now?
Absolutely. So the thing with grief is it hurts more the more that you fight it. And unfortunately, so much of the process of grief is fighting that it's even happening. So one of the first things that I would say, honestly, is to stop fighting it. Grief is inevitable. It is part of our human experience. It is part of our capacity to feel joy, to be able to grieve, to be able to feel anything. Grief is always going to be there. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't have very good examples of how to process grief or even how to feel grief. But really being able to sit with it is really important. Allow yourself to sort of surrender to the process of grief. The idea that there's a time limit on how long you get to grieve is also incredibly harmful, because you're essentially stopping yourself. And grief is one of those things, like I've mentioned before, is inevitable. As much as the grief may not stop, how we relate to it can definitely change. But stop trying to stop or control grief is something that makes it a lot harder to deal with. So give yourself the space. And also, finally, practicing gentleness in the process.
Kayla, thank you so much. Like, really good, actionable tips there. We appreciate you. Thanks.
Thank you so much.